Today we're going to take a look at the structure of the novel Kindred and try to figure out why Octavia Butler sets her book in two distinct time periods. Kindred is often defined as a genre-defying book, but it does fit snugly into the genre of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is kind of hard to define. It's one of those you know it when you see it kind of things. But I typically call it the literature of what if. It's what if robots could take over the world? What if there was a zombie apocalypse? You guys should be pretty familiar with speculative fiction because you studied it in 8th and 9th grade when you read Illustrated Man. You read the short story The Veldt, which includes these two kids. They've got their lions. They've got their high-tech nursery. You also may be familiar from certain movies like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and you can even tell that speculative fiction is very, very old because we have Frankenstein, which was published in the early 1800s. So as you can see from this diagram right here, speculative fiction covers a lot of different genres, and there are some genres where they overlap with speculative fiction. There are other ones, though, that some are speculative fiction and some are not. Like something like Dracula is not speculative fiction, but Frankenstein is. It uses science to make the monster. So my question for you is, what does Octavia Butler use to let us know that we are reading a speculative fiction story? Where do you think this story would fit on this diagram? One of the things you may remember from studying speculative fiction before is that an author who uses time travel or future setting is not making a comment on the time period the person travels to. The Veldt is not about the future where there's this super high-tech nursery where anything you imagine comes to life. No, Roddenberry was talking about the TV, his own time period. He was worried that the television would replace parents and become a babysitter. What I want you to do is read the quote on the board from speculative fiction author K.E. Lanning. What does she say is the reason science fiction authors use conventions like time travel? Here would be a discussion with my students about the meaning of the quote on the screen. Now we're going to talk briefly about the two settings of the novel. You all watched the crash course video for homework on this period in history, but I've put some of the major points up here on the screen. One of the major takeaways I want you all to have is that slavery was a social, legal, and economic institution. Antebellum South would not and could not be what we know it is without slavery. But this was an institution that came over with the first colonists, and it was not easy to abolish. Thomas Jefferson wrote about the abolition of slavery in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, but even he knew that in his own time period, that was not going to go through. The idea of slavery as a necessary evil continued throughout the Civil War and even warped into the argument that slavery was beneficial to slaves. As you can see over here, this is an image from Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and clearly this is not a beneficial situation for Uncle Tom. He's clearly being abused. He's clearly frightened. This is not a benefit for him in any way, shape, or form. A small glimmer, though, is that only a small percentage of slave owners owned large groups of slaves. The big plantations, the way we think of them, were actually not all that common. Slaves were very, very expensive. One common number I've seen for slaves is about $800 in 1818, which would be closer to $16,000 today. The Whalens, when we meet them in the novel, have over 30 slaves. What does this tell you about the place that Dana visits? Another key takeaway is that the book takes place after the transatlantic slave trade is abolished by Congress. This means that the only way for slavery to continue is for someone to either be sold into or born into slavery, and we're going to see both of those in this book. Black Americans could be sold into slavery if they committed a crime, or, more nefariously, free blacks from the North could be kidnapped and sold into slavery. This may sound familiar if you saw 12 Years a Slave. A person was born into slavery if his or her mother was a slave. It didn't matter who the father was. Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's slave and lover, was actually 3/4 white, and her half-sister was Jefferson's wife. But because Hemings' mother was a slave, so was Sally. Last and certainly not least, I want you guys to take away the violence and randomness of the treatment of slaves. You may remember when we read Night that Elie Wiesel talked about the best way to control a people is to make them feel less than human. It's the same thing here. By forcing people to perform forced labor and doling out physical and sexual abuse without reason, dehumanizes a people and makes them less likely to act out. This is one of the true tragic horrors of slavery. On a slightly lighter note, the other setting of the book is 1976. Now, some historians have dubbed the 70s the Me Decade, which is a stark contrast from the activism and civil rights of the 1960s. We'll get to the impact of the civil rights movement in a second, but what is important to know is that by the mid-1970s, civil rights activism had shifted away from domestic issues like the Civil Rights Act and bus boycotts and voting registration, more towards foreign issues, the idea of protesting the Vietnam War. By 1975, the Vietnam War had ended. About that time, the fight for women's rights was becoming more apparent, although it wasn't a foregone conclusion. In fact, the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972 wasn't ratified, where a lot of the other civil rights acts in the 60s were. So for someone like Dana, the fight over civil rights because of her race fell from public attention almost a decade ago, but the fight over her rights because of her gender are just getting started. So right here, I want to take a pause, and I want you to tell me, what do you think might be the reason Butler uses antebellum South in 1976 California as the setting in her book? As you can tell here, we've got two completely different worlds. So what's the point? Why bother having these two different settings? And even more, why bother having the character travel through time backwards and forwards to each of them?